Today is the 27th of October, 2015. Our topic is Ronald Reagan and the nuclear arms race, 1980 to 1988. My guest is Jeff Risner, who is on City Council as a professor of geology and an expert in computer technology. And I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University, and this is the Athens Speakout number 350. Now, last time, Jeff and I were talking about this problem of Reagan and technology, and I soon discovered that he knew much more about atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs than I knew, at least on the technological side. And my approach to war was based on history, the history of the balance of power. And I concluded that the Korean War, which was fought between 1950 and 53, was a real war, and it was not a metaphorical Cold War. And it was fought in 3 phases. And Stalin and Truman eventually concluded that Korea was not a place to experiment with an atomic bomb. From a military point of view, the North Koreans, in the first phase, won from June 1950 to August 1950. And the second phase started in October 1950 when General MacArthur crossed north of the 38th parallel and went up to the Yalu River in China. And MacArthur was winning a so-called sweeping victory. But this was an illusion, because in the third phase, when Mao Zedong intervened with millions of Chinese men, we have a long stalemate. And in the third phase, Mao Zedong won a kind of a Pyrrhic victory. At least he drove MacArthur back south of the 38th parallel, but that's about as far as he got. And Stalin, in January 1951, decided that he wasn't going to finance Mao Zedong with airplanes anymore. And he told Mao, well, if you want to fight in Korea, you do it with your own infantry. So the third phase was a long stalemate from January 1950 to July 1953. And Stalin suggested that they negotiate a ceasefire somewhere around the 38th parallel, and that was eventually accepted. And we have the DMZ, which was concluded in July 1950. Slightly more territory for the North, but hardly worth fighting for. And Dean Acheson then, like Stalin, said, let's have a compromise. And Acheson and Omar Bradley, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Services, told Truman, we got to fire General MacArthur. Yes, you have a question here.
Yeah, I wondered, how many, maybe Jeff knows this one, how many military troops do we have on the DMZ, right, as we speak? How many do you know?
No, Korea today?
I would doubt it's more than 20,000.
Yeah,
Might even be that high. Because, you know, Jimmy Carter wanted to dismantle them and send them home. But Ronald Reagan canceled that. So they still...
Probably not more than a division, really. Yeah.
We can check it on the internet. That can be
true.
found. I bet Jeff can find that in 30 seconds.
Yeah.
How many troops on the DMZ?
All right.
Google.
I said Jeff? Yeah, I guess I said Jeff.
You said me.
Okay, well, anyway, Omar Bradley and Dean Acheson Truman fired MacArthur in April of 1951. And the U.S. Army and Mao Zedong set up a line of infantry versus the howitzers, and the howitzers proved more effective. And Mao told North Korea, we're not going to supply any more infantry. You better sign. And that's how the war came to an end. It was a lost cause. Nobody won and nobody lost except the Koreans. They lost 50,000, 100,000 men
Yeah.
unnecessarily.
Who was in charge then? Was that Kim Jong-il or?
No,
was
that's
that
Kim
his
Kim
father?
Il-sung. Kim Il-sung, the old man.
The old man?
Yeah. He was a young man. He was much younger than Syngman Rhee.
Okay.
He was only
So we've had just 3 Kims in how many years, you know?
yeah, 3 Kims in 50, 60, over 50 years now.
It's a dynasty.
Dynasty. It's a new constitution.
And the young Kim's only about 30, so he could
Yeah,
be around.
yeah. It's a communist monarchy.
Figure that one out.
Well, anyway, radioactivity causes human death no matter what side you're on. And the atomic bomb is not a winning weapon. The atomic bomb is no umbrella overhead of protecting Europe from Stalin. And I think Mao put his finger on it during the Korean War. He wasn't afraid of the atomic bomb. He said it was only a paper tiger. Nobody in the United States took that propaganda very seriously, but it's coming to be the truth.
I thought he referred to the United States as a paper tiger.
Well, it might be. We'll have to check that out.
Everything is.
I interpreted it as the atomic bomb was a paper tiger. I misquoted him if that's the case. Anyway, I followed Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard. And by 1957, I was convinced that the escalation of hydrogen bombs were simply overkill. And we just had to wait a few years for Eisenhower to finally catch up with that philosophy. Jeff Risner then convinced me that Edward Tiller was a bigger fool than I thought he was. And he kept wanting to build more and more hydrogen bombs as if they were a viable weapon. And Winston Churchill had the better strategy. George F. Kennan had the better strategy. The Cold War is a metaphor, and the better metaphor is the Iron Curtain. And Kennan and Churchill said, well, we have conventional arms on this line from Stettin to Trieste, and gradually we'll convince the Soviets that they can't break through to the West. Their economy is just too small. And Kennan won. He was still alive in 1991 when Gorbachev dismantled the Soviet Union, proving that containment worked, but you had to be very patient. And most Americans are not very patient. They want to win in the next election. I don't know what they want to win, but they want to win something.
Instant gratification.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Eisenhower then had to resist John Foster Dulles, who was a fanatic anti-communist. And when Dulles died in 1958, Eisenhower began to move toward Adlai Stevenson's disarmament proposals, and he appointed a arms control agent in the White House, a liberal Republican by the name of Harold Stassen, to start negotiating with Soviet nuclear experts in getting nuclear arms control. And then Eisenhower retired in 1961 with a famous speech on the military-industrial complex, pointing out to the American people that the money spent on arms could be saved and build 10,000 schools, 10,000 hospitals, and we'd all be better off if they would gradually phase out the arms race.
Yes.
That's about where we ended. Do you want to add any further comments? Do we need to say anything more about Eisenhower's gradual conversion from MAD to military-industrial complex?
No, I don't think so. I think his evolution of thought took pretty much his 2 terms in office.
Well, it speeded up in the last 2 years.
It did.
He was rather slow in the first
Right,
6 years.
right, he was.
As long as Dulles was
Yeah.
wanting to fight in Indochina.
Well, that's right. That part of the party that was sort of holding him in.
Yeah.
At the same time, as you.
And then
point-
Cuba, they had the Cuba problem.
Sure, right. But that was small potatoes, I think, compared to Berlin and what was
Yeah.
going to happen in Indochina and so on. So
Yeah.
that was where our Eisenhower was more concerned
Yeah.
about.
Okay, if you have no further comments or objections, we can have a second question.
Mm-hmm.
Why did John F. Kennedy sign with Prime Minister Harold Macmillan of Great Britain
Mm-hmm.
and Nikita Khrushchev the first real disarmament treaty, the Atomic Test Ban Treaty,
Right.
Atmosphere Test, the Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty.
Right. It's
In
part-
August of 1963.
Right.
There you go.
Well, several things. Eisenhower, with his appointment of Harold Stassen, actually had the ball rolling.
Right.
Stassen was meeting with his counterparts in Geneva and Paris for several years. They were laying groundworks. They were opening up lines of communication. They were tossing ideas back and forth. Eisenhower and Macmillan was of the opinion they wanted a comprehensive arms treaty. They were looking at not just nuclear weapons, but conventional weapons and delivery systems. And they were trying to get a big picture here. The Russians were more hesitant on that. Conventional weapons, they had an abundance of. For every tank the United States had, the Russians had 10. So you have that going for you. And they were experimenting, of course, with rockets, and they were developing their own atomic weapons, doing above-ground testing. And there was two types of testing going on at this time, actually three. One was the type of testing that was an atmospheric test, which means you somehow get the device up into the air, high into the atmosphere.
Right.
As high as close to space as you can get it.
Right.
And then you detonate it and test, and you say, okay, the explosion was this big. That's an atmospheric test. Then you had an above-ground test where you just build a tower and explode the bomb on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, that's a very dirty bomb
Right.
because it produces a tremendous amount of radioactive dust, of what's called fallout.
Yeah.
And then that's going to come down either as particles or the rains will pick it up and it'll deposit hundreds of miles someplace else. Then all that radioactivity gets absorbed by, at one point it was dairy cattle in Wisconsin were consuming the radiation that was coming from Russian nuclear tests and was being produced in the milk.
Right.
You could test the milk. The milk was radioactive.
Strontium 90.
Right, yeah, strontium 90. Okay, and then there was a third category that wasn't done that much, but they did enough of them. They were underwater tests, where they would take an atomic bomb or a hydrogen bomb and explode it several hundred feet or several thousand feet down to see if it was a viable weapon as an anti-submarine device or would it create tsunamis. They're doing all these bizarre tests. Making an atomic torpedo.
Yeah.
A submarine would launch an atomic bomb at a battleship.
Yeah.
Well, okay, yes, you're going to blow up the battleship and everything else for a mile around it. So what good is that? I mean, what have you really done? So all this was going on, and but all the powers knew that some limitations need to be put in there, but they were trying to figure out how do you do this? How can we test our weapons and know that they actually are doing what they're supposed to do and not test them in actuality? So from when the Russians were detonating the huge atmospheric devices, like in '62, they detonated a 50 million ton hydrogen bomb, explosive, atmospheric. It was so huge that only their best bomber could put it up in the air because no missile was strong enough.
Right.
This thing was extremely heavy. And then the problem was the bomber, even though it was moving 600 miles an hour, wasn't fast enough to outrun the blast.
Uh-huh.
So they had to figure out a way of slowing the bomb down and let the plane get away. So there was all kinds of, but anyway, Andrei Sakharov was the man behind that one, who later became the great hydrogen bomb dissident of
Right.
Russia.
Right.
And
And it poisoned Kazakhstan.
yes, it's not a healthy place to be around. So So Kennedy was talking with his armed controls people. I think he's talking to one of his aides. I'm trying to think which one it was. The name doesn't come to me, but looking at the rain coming down on Washington and asking the guy, well, do you think there's fallout in it? And he said, oh, yes, Mr. President, there certainly is. So that's when Kennedy got more serious about this. He says, okay, what can we agree on? Well, the Russians did not want to give up their ground tests, okay? Now, you could put a bomb underground, put it a mile down and detonate it, and there'd be very little contamination on the surface. So they were holding out for that. They said, no, we want that. And the Americans were saying, no, we want to get rid of all testing. And the British, Macmillan, I think, this is where he comes in, says, listen, there's room to negotiate here. Okay, we can still have our underground nuclear tests. They act like earthquakes, so you know when one's being set off. So let's put that aside, and let's concentrate on the above ground, atmospheric, and underwater testing, and that's where what they now call the atmospheric test ban, which was really kind of a misnomer. It covered a lot more than just atmospheric tests. It covered, well, probably about 90% of the actual tests that were going on at that time. Because by this time, when they were building bombs that were so huge, you couldn't blow them up on the ground. Okay. You have craters that'd be a mile across. You wanted them up in the air or in outer space. Well, this abolished all that. So that in itself made testing huge nuclear weapons very unlikely, because you had to put them underground, and you don't want them to cause a huge earthquake. So
Right.
they had to get smaller.
Right.
But they could, they could get the same data from it. So you really didn't need a huge.
Right.
A big bomb is a propaganda weapon.
Right.
It's not a tactical weapon. It's not a strategic
Right.
weapon. So.
Convinced Teller, but nobody else.
Right. Well, Teller didn't like it. I mean, no, he did not. Absolutely not. He thought, oh, see, the Russians are going to march into Bucharest, and they're going to, just like the Nazis did, and we had to stand firm against them right now, Mr. President. And if we have to use atomic bombs, that's what we must use.
Right.
And they're thinking, you're out of your mind. You are really out of your mind to think for one moment that anybody in the United States would drop an atomic bomb on Moscow because the Russians are in Hungary.
Yeah.
No. Sorry. No, that ain't going to happen. And of course, well, he continued to agitate.
Right.
But he eventually, as Reagan shifts to Star Wars, Teller will make his big resurgent. He'll make his next great.
Well, I just want to get through Kennedy.
Yeah. So
Do you think maybe sometimes maybe Teller just wanted to see how effective that bomb was?
well,
what would motivate you to want to do?
I don't know. I think sometimes you get so caught in your own little thought that you don't quite see the big picture anymore.
Exactly.
Because if you start dropping one atomic bomb, you don't stop, like peanuts, you don't stop with one. It's going to go, you're going to use everything you got.
Yeah.
Because if I don't, the other guy will.
Right.
Yeah.
And there won't be anybody to telephone anybody because you've already taken them out. Yeah.
Well, I want to get back to Kennedy's psychology. There were two events which kind of speeded him up to sign this Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty in August of '63, just before his death. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
And in October, when they were negotiating taking the missiles out of Cuba, John Kennedy discovered that all of his advisors, Dean Rusk and McNamara, didn't know anything about it, and they were willing to blow up the world for Cuba.
Yeah, right.
So he got scared, and he said, okay, let's call Khrushchev. Let's get down here and let's
That's
get
right.
this treaty going.
It takes something like that to
Right.
really change your mind.
Right, right.
That sets the seeds. Same thing I think happened with Eisenhower with the nuclear.
And then
tests and
the other political thing was, what are you going to do about France and China? Now, the Chinese tested their bomb in August of '64.
That's right.
So they were going to have 5 powers sign. But eventually only 3 signed.
That's right.
United States, Britain wanted it from the
yeah, of
beginning.
course, sure.
United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union,
France held out.
they
De
wanted to
Gaulle.
test it more.
That's right, they did.
But by 1964, both France and China had satisfied their atomic scientists. Oh, we have a bomb that works.
Yeah.
And then they more or less agreed to the formula
More or less, yeah.
on a unilateral basis.
Yeah. France is the only one. China continued to do underground. They didn't do atmospheric. Now, France continued to do above-ground atmospheric tests in the Pacific into the 1970s.
Right.
They were still doing it. And that's when you...
Well, they were poisoning some islands, and then we had
they're
peaceniks out there in
sure.
New Caledonia.
Right, right.
And eventually, the
they
French were losing more than they gained in it.
Not quite sure what they thought they were gaining from it, but...
Nothing. Okay, so anyway, they unilaterally gave up on overkill.
That's right.
And at this point, so now, even in the Atmosphere Test Ban Treaty, John Kennedy made a speech in American University and just unilaterally said, well, I'm signing this.
Yeah.
Even though his CIA and
That's
defense
right.
people saying, we don't want to sign it.
I'm just not going to do it.
Yeah, I'm just going to unilaterally sign Macmillan.
Right.
I'm going to sign Macmillan and
Yeah.
Khrushchev's draft.
Uh-huh. Now, Khrushchev didn't jump into it until July of '63.
July of '63.
So,
okay.
so he was the last one to. He was still holding out,
Yeah.
but eventually he came around to it. I think
He came around before Kennedy did.
Well, see, when did Kennedy made
It was
that?
August.
August, yeah.
August '63.
Yeah.
And that may have been, because this is another speculation, it may have been significant for Kennedy's assassination, if you believe in the conspiracy theory.
Well, it's good
A lot
ideas.
of people in the CIA resented Kennedy signing a deal with Khrushchev.
Right, but it didn't. Kennedy's death didn't abrogate the treaty. And in fact, the treaty wasn't even ratified until much later under Johnson.
Okay, all
so
right.
I mean, so there's.
Well,
there's
Johnson couldn't block it.
Now remember, there's a couple different ways you can do with a treaty. You can have a formal ratification by the Senate, and then that becomes a law like the Constitution.
Right.
And a lot of people don't quite realize that if you sign a treaty that is ratified by the Senate
Right.
is actually now part of the Constitution of the United States, the same as if it's an amendment.
Right. It's part of the statutory law.
It's as defined by the Constitution. It's very
Right.
explicit when
Right.
it says about ratification of treaties. The other way to do it is you just say, okay, we have the treaty framework here. I know these guys, these yahoos in the Senate, for political reasons, they're going to block this. They're going to make political hay. I'm not going to give them the chance.
Right.
Okay? But being president and commander-in-chief, I will abide by the terms.
Right.
And there's not a damn thing they can do about it. They can huff and puff and blow all they want, but if I, as commander-in-chief, say, do not test another bomb will not be tested.
Okay. Well, I guess we've finished the Kennedy administration.
Yep.
And Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, then became president and was elected in his own right as president in November of '64. And he was campaigning against Goldwater, a kind of a fool from Arizona, who said he would nuke the Vietnamese and he'd end the war quickly.
Absolutely. Hanoi, go smoke.
Well, anyway, Goldwater took 5 states.
Yeah.
Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, the Deep South, who were worried about blacks still. And then he took his own state of Arizona. But Johnson won the North and the South overwhelmingly. But then Johnson pulled a dirty deal. Because during the campaign, he said, well, we don't want any wider war.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That worked out well.
And then in August of '64, he pulls off this Gulf of Tonkin, and he decides to expand the Vietnam intervention.
Right.
But he doesn't think of nukes.
No, we don't go nuke.
You're going to have to have. You're going to have infantry. You're going to have infantry, tanks, and Marines. They're going to roll it back.
That's right.
They're going to do it the hard way.
Yep.
And I'll win it in 4 years,
Yeah,
so Johnson
sure.
thought. Okay, well, I'm ready now for another question on Henry Kissinger, unless you have to say anything more about
No?
Lyndon Johnson's non-negotiations
Right.
from 1964
No, not much.
60. Nothing was done.
No, not really. Not on the official level. I'm sure that there was.
Oh, but you say he ratified the treaty. I missed that point.
Yeah, well, that was very early in his administration.
Yeah.
So I mean, that was just sort of on the feel-good moment of
John Kennedy's death
and so on.
Of course, he wanted to endorse Kennedy on civil rights.
Exactly, right.
So it all made Johnson.
Yeah, but as for going back to the Soviets and saying, well, can we I don't know, ban underground testing, or can we actually have arms reduction? Can we reduce the number of warheads, and so on? That not much happened there.
Nothing happened. No. Okay, so let's get to Henry Kissinger. What gave Henry Kissinger, a German Jew who was already suspected by Richard Nixon on personal grounds, on the Indochina as well, political grounds. Nevertheless, Henry Kissinger had authority on atomic energy in the eyes of Richard Nixon.
Yes, well,
and what accounts for his expertise?
Kind of a fluke. Henry, you're the expert on his educational background, but there's nothing in his background or education-wise or military-wise that would say, yes, he really knows about atomic bombs. He knows about...
Well, as far as the eyes of the public.
That's part, yeah. But in 1957, he wrote some essays which became a book. I think it's like Foreign Policy and Nuclear War, some title like that.
Right.
And he was arguing, which I think erroneously, that nuclear weapons could be used in a limited engagement. Now, I don't quite understand what that means.
Tactical.
I suppose, as if, okay, let's place a hypothetical situation where the Russians, in a conventional war, invade from East Germany to West Germany. They send their tanks in. The United States, NATO, realizes we just don't have the resources here. France has said, we're not getting involved. We're not going to send any troops. So you can't count on us, and time's limited. Okay, we'll hit their front positions with several small tactical nuclear weapons, and that'll take care of it. They'll stop, and they'll think, that's not a good idea.
Right.
And they won't retaliate.
But this was just a theory in political science.
That's all it was. I mean, it's an essay.
Yeah.
How would you even begin to test that?
Right.
You could. The Pentagon, of course, had been doing things called wargaming.
Right.
You know, the militaries always do that. The Prussians started that back in the time of Frederick the Great, and they're fairly successful.
As long as you had cannons and swords.
In fact, there's a classic story where the night before the D-Day invasion, the chief of the general staff of the German army in France was called away from their positions because there was a war game exercise going on.
Yeah.
One of the generals that had to go there, I think it was Pimser, had to play the part of Eisenhower.
Right.
And he won the war game because in his strategy he invaded in Normandy. Okay, so war games can have their practical effect. So the Pentagon had been doing war gaming with nuclear weapons, but everything always pointed out the fact that once you drop the first one, you don't stop. There is no way to recall it.
Yeah.
Because our whole strategy that we had based on like the Strategic Air Command and that was built up was an entire everything goes approach. It's not, you can't, there was no mechanism to go piecemeal.
Yeah.
So even if Kissinger wanted or advocated for a limited use of nuclear weapons, there was no mechanism in place or even one that you can imagine that would work that could accomplish that.
Yeah.
What you'd have to do is you'd have to tell the battlefield commanders, you have authority over your own nuclear stockpile. And that's the last thing you would ever want to do.
Okay.
Okay, you have a commander, now I can drop an atomic bomb anytime I want. Hey, it's Dr. Strangelove. It's like a movie.
Yeah.
And that's a scenario you don't want to do.
Well, that book had influence in the Pentagon, at Harvard University.
And Herman Kahn's book that came out about thermonuclear war.
When Nixon became president, that gave him credibility that he wasn't a peacenik, he wasn't a McGovern, he wasn't a Democratic dove. He would seriously consider using the nuclear bomb in some capacity. Well, that satisfied Nixon.
Yeah, right.
And then Kissinger, when he got in office, worked out the details, and did work out a limited ABM deal. That was a limitation.
Now, the anti-ballistic missile, the ABM. Okay, that was well, of course, that's coming up. I guess as part of the discussion. But the point between of ABM is has nothing to do with limited nuclear warfare. And ABM means I now have the capability of stopping the nuclear missiles before they hit their targets.
That was the theory.
That was the theory. And the problem with ABM, like any other nuclear arms race, is we went through the whole idea of submarines and bombers and ICBMs, and now both sides have hundreds of each out there. Now you're going to start a whole new classification of weapons to prevent these weapons from coming in.
Right.
Well, there's two really bad things come out of that. One is it starts another arms race. So again, you're putting billions and trillions of dollars into weapons that may never be used, that are just sitting around waiting for something to happen. They're not used. There they are. The other is when you had this whole philosophy of mutual assured destruction, the MAD philosophy, either side could destroy the other, which meant neither side wanted to risk it. If now you said, well, wait a minute, I have all these anti-ballistic missile devices. I can stop all their missiles. I could take the punishment. I will only get hurt a little bit, but I can blow them all to smithereens. So now I've unbalanced everything. So the balance of power is gone. It's shifted to one side or the other, whoever can get the most. So one of the emphasis that Nixon saw was, we got to stop that.
Right.
We have to put an end to it. And they came up with the ABM treaty in 71.
One launcher each side.
One launcher each side, and which only the Russians built one. They put one around Moscow. The United States could have put one around Washington. It was never built. The United States...
Well, they did put one out in North Dakota, didn't they?
No.
That was just a bluff.
No ABMs were ever built. No, we never built a single ABM.
Robert, we got to stay.
But they had the treaty power to do it.
We had the treaty power to do it. We could do that.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we have to stop. Yeah. We're discussing the nuclear arms race, and we've got the story up to Henry Kissinger and his alleged expertise. And finishing up on Henry Kissinger, my guest is Jeff Risner, who knows more about the ins and outs of the technology of this. And I was always looking at Kissinger as a scholar of the balance of power. Mm-hmm. And his first book was his PhD thesis entitled Metternich,
yeah.
Castlereagh, and the Balance of Power from 1812 to 1822. And he became quite a fan of Metternich. And that kind of thinking led Kissinger to be far advanced of any Democratic Secretary of State. Mm-hmm. Because the Democratic Secretary of State somehow or other lost the early historical thinking of Washington to John Quincy Adams, when Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson mm-hmm. and Madison all understood the European balance of power. Mm-hmm. And John Quincy Adams understood that the United States could only make a deal in the multi-power world. You had a balance between England, France, and Spain. Mm-hmm. And there's no such thing as a imperial policy that we can be number one. But the myth of 1945 is the United States is now number one.
That's right.
Therefore, all we have to do is to defeat communism, and we're the unilateral and only power left. Mm-hmm. Well, that was a pure mythological nonsense, mm-hmm. which I didn't believe, and Henry Kissinger didn't believe,
nope.
and George Kennan didn't believe, and Winston Churchill didn't believe.
No.
And when Winston Churchill, when I went to Germany in 1955, Winston Churchill opened up a summit agreement with Khrushchev and got Eisenhower to sit down there, but Eisenhower wasn't ready for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. But he was coming along to it.
He was coming along to it. Well, anyway, Henry Kissinger is the man to watch for the future.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, he wrote a total of 15 books. Now, I met Henry Kissinger in 1957, after he published this book, because I had a PhD advisor who said, well, you ought to read this book, and he might visit Michigan. And when he does, he spoke before a little group of a dozen graduate students outlining this book. And I didn't quite buy all of Henry Kissinger's theory because I had been a student of Hans J. Morgenthau before I ever met or ever heard of Henry Kissinger. And I was a student of A.J.P. Taylor in Oxford, who believed in the balance of power. And he wrote a book on the balance of power leading down to 1914 and the First World War.
Right.
And he began his book in 1848 and calls his book The Struggle for the Mastery of Europe. And A.J.P. Taylor had a very low opinion of American cold warriors, thought they were a lot of hot air. So anyway, I was kind of an advanced graduate student in a way. I asked Henry Kissinger a routine question. I wasn't going to challenge him.
Right.
I was just suspicious. And he gave me a routine answer.
Okay, well, okay.
So that was the end of the conversation.
Well, you should have
And the other
challenged him.
graduate students were just sitting there kind of, I don't remember any question from them. They weren't going to question him.
Robert, what was it that you disagreed with Henry?
What, Henry Kissinger? That you could use tactical weapons. I didn't buy the theory. I was already suspicious of tactical weapons. I believed, as Szilard believed, as Oppenheim believed, as Einstein believed. I don't know who's going to win World War III, but World War III, if it ever takes off, we're going to have World War IV fought with sticks and stones.
Yeah, I think Einstein said.
Yeah. Well, Szilard believed that.
Yeah.
Oppenheimer
And they were
Oppenheimer
being
said, "Don't build it."
optimistic.
Yeah.
So we were.
But didn't Henry Kissinger kind of modify his ideas as time went on?
Well, I think he gave up on tactical weapons. He was thinking of it in 50. He was thinking in 57. Well, keep this limited, because the big debate at that time was Korea is a limited war. Well, okay, if you have a limited war, maybe a limited bomb could work. But Henry Kissinger never wanted to bomb the Soviet Union. And he never wanted to bomb China. He didn't think of this as the winning weapon or the ultimate weapon. No. And Henry Kissinger didn't have much to say about the Cold War. He let that up for Richard Nixon to talk about how the Democrats lost China. I don't think.
Now, was he just promoting a book there at the university?
He was promoting his own book.
Yeah, okay.
And he wrote a second book with the same line. It was called Necessity of Choice. And the necessity of choice kind of advanced the theory a little bit further. It came out in 1964. He said, you're going to have to make a choice of whether to build a small bomb or not. That was a necessity of choice.
I see.
But you couldn't have, the other part was, well, let's go for disarmament. And he just left it up as a balance of terror. Well, which part of the dilemma do you want to choose?
Yeah.
And he left that up to the next president. So the necessity of choice kind of clarified his earlier book on atomic energy and the foreign policy.
Right.
Okay, so I'm ready now to go to the next question. Why did Henry Kissinger and the Soviet nuclear experts and the American nuclear experts, after he got into power in 1969, signed the SALT I Treaty? And how did the SALT I Treaty lead to the ABM? That's the question.
Well, the SALT stands for the Strategic Arms Limitation.
Right. Sorry about the jargon.
There's a lot of that in there. You can't get away from it.
Yeah.
Well, this is actually an extension of Kennedy, McMillan, and Khrushchev's atmospheric test ban treaty. It's something that could have occurred earlier, but didn't. Vietnam, big problem. Opening up relationships with China and so on. Those were things that got the front burner. This got put on the back burner. In the meantime, our nuclear arsenals are continuing to multiply. The Russians now we're getting close to parity with us in terms of warheads. And we already knew what they could do with their missiles because they had been launching Sputniks and astronauts and cosmonauts on orbit. And it looked like they could put a man on the moon, which they didn't. That program ended in a fiasco for them. So at this time with Kissinger, the time was right. This is when they could say, okay, we're going to get rid of the, we're going to actually talk about limitations. We had been talking about limiting testing. Now we're actually going to look at weapons themselves. So that was the promise of it.
Right.
So, and Kissinger, of course, I think, now he wasn't Secretary of State at that time, I don't believe.
No, he was a National Security Advisor.
Security Advisor, so.
Yeah, but they set up this nuclear expert committee
Yeah.
to go to Helsinki. All right,
Yeah.
well, you count the missiles and the bombs
That's
and
right.
the subs and come up with a formula.
Right. Yeah.
that both sides agree to.
And how do we do that? How do you verify? How do you do this? How do you do that? And the more you get into it, the more complicated it gets.
Yeah.
And I think it's the type of project that Kissinger is just ideal for, because he really is kind of a minutia guy. He likes details.
Well, he knew something about military,
he does.
and he knew something about balance of power.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, his military experience.
He didn't know too much about economics. He delegated that.
Well, you can't be an expert at everything. So this was one of those things, and I think it goes also along with the lines of only Nixon could go to China.
Yeah.
Well, only Nixon could pull off a strategic arms limitation
Right.
agreement with the new Soviet hierarchy.
Right.
You know, one of the things that also sort of derailed things, that Khrushchev got deposed. You know, and then
64.
64, and Brezhnev and Kosygin came in, and then there was sort of an internal power struggle in the Kremlin,
Right.
because both of them were sort of vying to become the head guy, and eventually Brezhnev won out.
Right.
Well, you know, while that's happening, it's kind of hard to negotiate.
All right.
So they had their own internal dynamics as well. So that's why it finally, you know, what, 71, I think, finally it came around, but that was it. In terms of the historical agreements, I don't know if it really ranks up there as one.
Are you talking about the ABM now?
No,
or
the
SALT one?
SALT one.
Yeah, well, the SALT one was signed in 69.
69. Okay.
But it took them all of those years, from 69 to 72, to come to the final signature.
Yeah.
It was up to Brezhnev and Nixon
Yeah.
to sign it.
That's right.
So when he went to Moscow in
He sure did.
72, they had this complicated thing, and Nixon had read all of the stuff, and he was ready to sign.
Yeah.
But who counted the submarines? That was left to this nuclear expert committee.
Yeah.
And if the Soviets agreed to it,
Yeah.
and the testing and the verification, then Kissinger, in other words, Nixon finally agreed with Kissinger that got to get out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
And this was a way of satisfying the Vietnam fiasco.
Yeah.
And
It
the
does-
exchange
it
for
does
the
dovetail
Moscow
into that,
deal
sure.
was they're going to both go to Beijing. Dallas, from Kissinger's point of view, you balance China off against.
That's right. Play the China card.
Yeah, in politics
Yeah.
and arms, and Chinese are not going to have enough arms to worry about. And we're just going to tell Khrushchev and, Brezhnev
Brezhnev,
and Mao, we're going to get out of Vietnam. But don't escalate it until after Nixon is reelected. And they agreed to that informal advice.
Excuse me.
You're going to get what you want.
That's
Both
right.
of you are going to get something. Okay. So unless you want to say something about the technical details of how the ABM treaty, how does it slow down the arms race? That's the important thing.
Well,
In other words, if you only
right.
make one device,
Yeah.
there's not going to be an escalation of ABMs,
exactly.
underground,
Right.
multi-warheads. What do they call that?
MIRVs.
MIRVs.
Yeah.
They're going to stop the MIRVs.
Stop the MIRVs. Yeah, because the problem that was coming up was, see, Russian technology with all their space exploration stuff, that also has military value, and they were learning that one rocket can deliver more than one warhead.
Right.
Okay, all you have to do at some point is just split it apart, and away they go. Well, with the ABM treaty technology, they were trying to figure out, well, how in the world do we shoot down all these individual?
Right.
So part of the agreements that they were striving for was, listen, this MIRV stuff, we've got to put a cap on that. We got to limit that.
Right.
Okay. Well, you don't do that, guys. We won't do it. You won't do it. It'll make our ABM treaty easier to
Enforce.
enforce and so on. But I think what the ABM stands out really good is here you had a whole technology coming out that should have had this great strategic potential for nuclear weapons, and both sides should have really been screaming to get it, yet they stopped it.
Sure.
So it was possible. It was possible to stop something before it actually got going.
Right. That's disarmament. That's
Yeah.
arms limitation.
Uh-huh.
That's peace.
It couldn't be done before, but then suddenly
Right.
it was possible. You know?
Right. Well, I guess you don't want to say anything more about the details of that. We'll go on to another interesting deal. What did the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty do, and how was that negotiated and signed by 1970?
Well, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was something that had been going on that the United Nations had been pushing for
Right.
for many years.
Well, it started in 1958.
Right. And they were getting many non-nuclear powers
That's right.
to already sign
Right.
on. And essentially they were saying, I promise I will not develop nuclear weapons.
Right.
Now, if you're a country that already has nuclear weapons, well, how do you sign it, and what do you do with it? I already have nuclear weapons, and I don't want to give them up.
Right.
So you have a problem there. What the UN was saying, well, listen, we already know the Americans and the Russians have nuclear weapons. Perhaps we can, and of course, then the British got them almost immediately. Then France got them, and then China got them. Perhaps we can persuade the other countries in the world not to do that, and they did. Many countries went along with that. There were some notable exceptions, though. India, no.
Right.
Now, which was, I always thought, extremely ironic, a country that had been one of the great proponents of the Third World
That was under Nehru,
under Nehru.
but he's finally retired.
Yeah. But,
He was an idealist.
Yeah, they needed a nuclear weapon to
And then the
counterbalance-
Chinese fiddled around on the Himalayan mountains.
Yeah, that's a good reason.
And they didn't trust the Pakistanis.
No.
Never did.
So they started developing their nuclear weapons, which of course then the Pakistanis did with the help of the Saudis.
Right.
I mean, Pakistan is so dirt poor they could never possibly have afforded to buy
Right.
anything.
Right.
So the Saudis paid for the development, and well, the odds are pretty good the Saudis have an atomic bomb at Riyadh right now. So
Okay, well,
Anyway.
I'll go back to 1958. It was the Irish Prime Minister who first suggested the idea of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. And the UK immediately endorsed it because everybody in Britain knew that Britain was too small compared to the United States and the Soviet Union. So they took the initiative in negotiations. So anyway, in 1968, the United Nations General Assembly endorsed a draft of this Irish suggestion, and Finland was the first nation state, being a neighbor of Soviet Union, to sign it. And then the idea expanded very rapidly to 190 nations. And they were only worried about the big five nuclear powers in the beginning.
right.
And some countries had the potential, like Sweden and South Africa. South Africa actually started one. But as soon as the blacks got the power, they said, well, we're going to abandon that project.
Well, they dismantled it. There's very good evidence that, and in fact, I think it's documented that they actually tested it.
Yeah, right.
Had a pretty
But
good
it wasn't going to do the whites any good now.
No.
They had to become a minority in
right.
a black government. So anyway, they divided the group into what they call three pillars. The 190 agreed never to build a nuclear weapon. And they would have a review committee every 5 years to see how this was being lived up. And then the potential new nuclear states you've already outlined, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and the fourth one was Israel, who never signed it.
No.
And that's where thing began to become stalled about 1970, and it didn't advance very far after 1970. And you've already pointed out that India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel have started to make weapons, nuclear weapons, in defiance of the great ideal of the Irish, the Finns, and the British. Now, the French and the Chinese unilaterally agreed to limit theirs to 200 or 300 bombs, so they're not a problem. But Israel is one of the major problems here, because they never claimed that they had one, but they just wouldn't sign it.
Right.
But intelligence in the United States found out that they did have a secret plant in Dimona.
Yeah.
And Israel had a defector in 1986, Mordecai Vanunu. And he committed treason against the state of Israel by leaking to the Western press that the Israelis already had a bomb, and they were making them at Dimona. And now the question is, well, who's going to count these bombs here? And actually, apparently, the French and the Americans and the South Africans smuggled parts to make this nuclear capability. And some Israeli spies in France and the United States may have stole those parts. And it's just not clear how that bomb was put together by bits and pieces.
Well, what it is, well, they know what kind they are. They know they're plutonium bombs. They're not uranium bombs.
And they now, the Swedish Disarmament Agency has counted. They have 80.
Yeah.
So if you look at the final results, what are they going to do with 80 bombs?
Well, if you detonated them, you would destroy the entire state of Israel. So
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
it would be a desert that would be
Right. But we haven't convinced Netanyahu that he better get into it anyway.
no.
So that was the problem of the so-called Israeli bomb. Do you have any disagreements with that analysis?
No, the only stories I've heard about it was that the apartheid government, when they were so afraid that they were going to be overrun by Cubans from Namibia and so on, they did a crash program to develop an atomic bomb with the Israelis' help, and their part of the deal was, since South Africa had the necessary uranium ore that Israel needed for their reactors, and by this
They
time...
did this during the Cuban crisis
They did it...
in the 60s.
The detonation, I think, happened in the 80s.
In the 80s, okay.
Yeah, it was an atmospheric test.
Yeah, they said it was a meteorite.
That's right.
That was the American cover-up.
Yeah, everyone's going...
Just a strange sight we
Yeah,
saw.
I remember that on the news when that came up and the explanation about it, and even then I thought...
Doubted it.
That really doesn't make any sense.
That's right.
But according to the reports I've read, that they were lucky with that. That satellite was... had taken the flash of the third test.
I see.
Not the first one.
I see.
They had done two before that.
They just went down the ocean, did
No, they did. These were atmospheric, but their weights in the South Atlantic Indian Ocean area, it's practically uninhabited. There's almost nothing there.
I see.
So they detonated these things, and yes, there was some fallout. Okay,
Right.
I mean they could detect it, but it was so diffused and in such different locations. No detectors in the
Fell
southern.
on Antioch.
Yeah,
It
no,
killed
yeah.
some penguins.
Right. So it pretty much went undetected. But the third test, the satellite had been repositioned because that radiation that was detected had got the American Defense Department suspicious. They knew something was up, but they couldn't prove it. So they repositioned the satellite so that now it was flying more in that area so they could get a view. Because normally there's nothing in the South Atlantic that you'd ever want to take a picture of.
Right.
Okay. So they moved it further south, and they got lucky that time.
Right.
to see that flash.
Right.
And I mean, they knew without any doubt,
Right.
what it was.
Right.
So it was like they call up the South Africans. They go, we know what
Right.
they have.
Right. So you and I are both skeptical of television reports.
Well, let's just say I kind of analyze what comes in.
Yeah, for different reasons, I guess.
and frankly, I don't think the news commentator on CBS News particularly bought the story either. He seemed to be rather suspicious about the whole thing.
Yes, you have a question?
2 minutes.
Oh, we have to stop here.
Okay.
So I guess we'll stop with this problem, and we'll talk about the final statistics of this strategic arms race next time. I think this is probably a good point to stop in 1970 with
Okay.
the conclusion of most of the people who's ever signed this, and the 4 signers. And North Korea, we might say, has 8, but they can do very little with 8. Anyway, thank you for coming.
Okay.
We called this that debate is the auction of democracy, and we're still debating the ins and outs of the nuclear arms race,
Right.
and we'll have to continue this next time.
Okay.
Do you have any further summary?
No, that pretty much sums it up.
Good.
It's
Well, we stopped at an opportune moment.
yes.